Quick update to this video. This was a 30-minute long episode on new werewolf stories, but I decided to make it way longer. So I added 3 new scary stories after the werewolf ones, and an old set of Bigfoot stories that not a lot of folks listen to. Tomorrow, my wife and I are gonna go and have a baby girl. So I'm hoping y'all will enjoy this video for a couple of days, so I can focus on that. But I'll be back as soon as possible, with more scary stories. Beware the howls that sound a bit too deep, a bit too strange, and a bit too close. Those howls are not normal, and by the time you hear them, it may be too late. Welcome back to Unexplained Encounters. I'm your host, Darkness Prevails, and you can follow me on Twitter at Prevails if you want to peer into my mind while I ask God why he has cursed me with weekly werewolf nightmares. Today I've got a very creepy set of brand new werewolf stories, featuring wolf-like creatures sighted too close to home, and howls that sound nothing like typical wolves. Enjoy, and don't forget, you can have your story narrated on this show. Just send me your creepy and believable stories of the unexplained at darkstories.org. Finally, go to eeriecast.com for more scary shows like this. Now, let's begin. Werewolf by the Pond, from Guppiesgarden. I'm a 21-year-old woman who lives in a log cabin down a dead-end road in the middle of the countryside. I have lived here my entire life, so this life is what I know best. I have about 3 neighbors. This is important, as it will take place around my closest neighbor's property. I wanted to tell this story because this neighbor has since passed. She was a Spitfire Italian woman who drank beer and ate raw garlic with every meal. She passed at the ripe old age of 98 and was the kindest and toughest soul you'd ever meet. For context, I live in southern Illinois, close to the border of Missouri and Kentucky, so you can gauge the landscape I'm surrounded by. You've probably guessed, but I'm bordered in by a large cornfield to my back and miles of woods spanning into the next town over. I've always enjoyed the scenery around me. It feels tranquil most of the time. However, this is the countryside. There's bound to be weird occurrences every now and again. One thing I can say confidently is that I have absolutely no explanation for what happened to me when I was 16. I'll preface this by saying I faced many larger animals. One time I was within 10 feet of a black bear in Tennessee. There was even one known to have broken free from a traveling train circus that ran through the area. The old train tracks and shack are still in the woods, just a mile from my house. The bobcats I chased out of my driveway are no threat. Same with the coyotes that yelped outside my window most nights. Even the cougar that my dad had to shoot at to scare it off the property when I was younger wasn't nearly as scary as this thing, which I so clearly encountered. To paint you a picture leading up to that day, I'll start with what I heard a few days prior. It was the weekend. I remember this because usually my dad would not ask me to drive after dark. Most of us don't here, due to the volume of deer and lack of street lamps, and especially if I had school the next day. I had to drive him to the store, and still have to because he has a condition where he cannot drive himself. I'd begged him to make his famous chili, and he agreed to make it later in the week if he had the groceries. When we arrived home, the sun had just set, and as I was grabbing the last few bags out of the trunk, I heard it. This was not a coyote. I've heard every sound they make, yelping, crying, howling, fighting, whatever it may be. But I can tell. This howl I heard, it was a singular howl, and it was very deep. But worst of all, it was close. It came from the cornfield behind my house, which starts around 30 feet from where I stood. I shot my head up and looked at my dad. He was wide-eyed, a man who I know to not be afraid of dang near anything, but now he had an expression of pure terror on his face. He turned to me and almost ripped the door off its hinges, whisper yelling at me to run inside now. That night, we both sat in the living room in silence. He even changed the TV from his normal cryptid-centered shows to Pawn Star. We tried to think if there could somehow be wolves in the area passing through, but came up with nothing. We decided to call it a coy wolf, coyote and wolf hybrid, and forget about it. However, we both knew there was no chance it was this far south without being spotted somewhere, either by hunters, farmers, or in the towns. But fear does play mind games. I will say I forgot about this for a few days. I was focused on my exams coming up in school at the time. I remember because I had to wake up earlier to go in and prepare for testing, which is exactly what happened on my last testing day before winter break. It was foggy that morning. I was thinking of going out and feeding the chickens. I pulled my blinds to look out at their coop and to see if their solar door had come up yet. Mind you, the sunrise barely touched the tree stumps, and the fog made it even darker out there. I went to put on my coat and was going to see if the elderly neighbor I mentioned had fed her also very old dog. I figured my barn cats also needed some breakfast, so I headed outside before leaving for school. After feeding and loving on my cats, I headed for the chicken coop, and as I walked around my dad's pole barn, I saw it. It was by my neighbor's pond. At first, I thought it was her, or maybe her fishing gear, or even her lawnmower. I'm telling you, every possible option ran through my mind first, until it began to move. A stray dog would be most plausible, but what stray dog is that huge? It had to have been two beefy Irish wolfhounds stacked on top of each other in a black fursuit. Otherwise, it wouldn't make any sense. I stopped dead in my tracks, hiding behind a stack of wooden pallets behind the pole barn. I've never been struck with this amount of fear before. I didn't even have a weapon nearby. I felt myself fade out for a second before gaining the courage to look again, hoping it had not made its way to me during that time. I peeked out again, and I was very sure now of what I was looking at. An extremely large wolf. I'd grown up hearing locals talk about large black dogs sighted in backyards and appearing on trail cams, but never did I think I would see it in person myself. This thing was massive compared to her brick sign with the pond name on it. I was 5'4". My chin would be right at the top of the sign, and the creature was easily almost at that height, just with its shoulders. The first part of it I could make out was the higher hind legs. Its back came sloping down to slightly shorter front legs, but bulky shoulders. Its muscles were obvious through its fur. This is still the visual ingrained into my memory to this very day. I felt as if I was just waiting for it to turn towards me. The curiosity along with fear to identify the creature gnawed at my mind. I was so pumped with adrenaline. I wanted to run, but I wanted to know for sure if it was truly there and not just in my head. After all, it was very early. Maybe I was just tired, I thought. I started gaining my sense of reality back and realized my neighbor's dog had been barking the entire time. This is a blind and deaf dog, so he knew something, smelled something was there. I guess this was bothersome to that creature. It started to turn back towards the deepest part of the woods. It lifted its head, and I saw it. I saw the light bounce off its eyes and wet nose. I watched it lick its chops. The fangs on this wolf made my heart sink. It could easily charge me, and if it did, I would be done for in seconds. Fight or flight kicked in at that point, and I hightailed it back to my room. I sat on my floor staring out the window, watching it become consumed by the trees. I must have sat there, waiting for almost an hour, because before long, my mom came to see if I was up for school. I didn't tell her what I saw. Instead, I asked her to check on my neighbor with my dad later today. Of course, she was confused by that request, but she sent me off to school with a promise that she would. I came home early that day. I ran into the house as fast as I could to be sure everyone was still there and alive. I remember my dad having a strange look, but he smiled at me after saying my neighbor was okay. He got that strange look back again after my mom left the room and told me that there was a coyote carcass by the pond. I told him to point out my window at where exactly they found it. He pointed perfectly to where I'd seen that wolf creature. I then explained everything I saw out of pure fear, and he looked as if he already knew what I was talking about. I became very paranoid about leaving doors or windows unlocked, checking the property at night when everyone was asleep, and I even researched late into the night about what else this could possibly have been, but nothing added up. Eventually, as time passed, I forgot about it for the most part. I would only give it thought when Dad's shows would mention wolf-like creatures. I heard some variation of the same howl I'd heard a couple of times after that in the passing months, but I was just glad it sounded farther away until it finally stopped. Of course, I'm still a bit creeped out to go outside at night, and I've been having recurring nightmares of this creature that I've deemed a werewolf. Some might say it can't be because it didn't stand up, but I believe if it didn't feel eyes on it, it most definitely would have. This thing that was much bigger than a wolf. I pushed it to the back of my mind for as long as I could, but eventually I wanted to share this experience instead of holding it back, trying to bury it deep down. However, out of fear of being called a liar, it took me some time. I've recently been having nightmares of werewolves nearly every night, and I felt it was time to share at last. I don't know if the creature will make its return, but I'm hoping it stays far away. I don't know what I saw, but I know it wasn't good. From Cheyenne. I want to preface this. I've always somewhat believed in these types of creatures. Aliens, skinwalkers, wendigos, spirits, etc. But I've always been the kind of person who doesn't just 100% flat out believe or not believe in something. I keep my mind open. I've simply believed that these things can be possible. Of course, just like anyone else who hasn't experienced something themselves, I had my doubts. Also, I want to add that I'm not the type to be scared of these things. When it comes to what I believe, I want to understand them. I feel a connection to them. One night, I was with my partner and our friend. We were at a wooded, rocky place by the ocean. We got there at about 9:30 p.m., and we were just going to have a fire on the rocks by the water. You would have to walk through some wooded area to get to those rocks. And as we pulled up to the area, I had a bad feeling for some reason. Usually I try to trust my intuition, but this time I told myself I was just psyching myself out. Once we got to the spot, I immediately felt a weird sensation. But again, I just told myself I was just making things up. Even so, I didn't turn my back to the open space. I kept myself facing towards the woods and rocky area. As the people I was with watched the fire, I stared out into the darkness, feeling like something was watching us. I decided to go to a rock farther away from the fire so my eyes could adjust to the darkness. Lo and behold, I see a translucent white figure about 50 feet away from us on top of the rocks on the other side of the area, pretty high up. This figure was moving back and forth. It looked to be about 5 or 6 feet tall. It started to scale down the rocks. And when I say scale, I mean fast, like faster than any person possibly could. And as it was doing that, it gets smaller and turned into the shape of an animal, which looked to be a coyote or wolf. I say out loud, "What is that animal?" My partner looks over and immediately gets super sketched out, just as I was. The other person we were with wasn't bothered by it for some reason. He said he saw it, but in the moment he was trying to convince us it was just a person. Then again, he was drunk at that point. As I see this canine-like thing coming towards us, I begin to feel absolute horror, like I know that it's coming to kill us. I tried to go higher up on the rocks to get away from it. I literally thought that was it. I thought I was going to die that night. I had the most horrifying feeling, and it was genuinely the scariest, most terrifying thing I've ever felt or seen. I pulled out my phone, shining my flashlight on it to make sure I wasn't just tripping. I think that deterred whatever it was away from us, because it ended up running into the woods and disappearing. My partner and I were completely horrified by this event. My legs were even shaking violently. I said that we should leave immediately. The friend that we were with wanted to stay to finish his drink, but we demanded to go. He told us that he would prove it was just some person. How did he do that? Well, he tried to run down the rocks as fast as he could, trying to show us that a person could go that fast. But when he did, we could clearly hear him running around on those rocks. And that's the scary part about what we saw. Because when that thing was running around them even faster than him, it was completely silent. We weren't able to process what had happened until we'd gotten home after dropping our friend off. When we did get back, we decided to do some research about skinwalkers and werewolves in the area where we were. Here's what we found. The first few things that come up when you Google the name of the place were several articles of deaths, which have occurred right where we were. Each one states that the deaths were from the waves knocking the people off and drowning them. But this wasn't what freaked us out about the research. I continued to scroll, and I came across this weird website. A website for stock photos, but for some reason, the description included the name of the location we were at. When I clicked through to the website, I literally could not believe what I saw. An image of a creature that looked a lot like what we'd seen earlier that night. We still have no idea what to make of this situation, but all I know is I'm still scared. I'm still trying to figure out what it may have been. Our Childhood Bush House, from Sheev 76. When we were young, my cousins and I had a bush house at the end of the back garden, just before the garden opened up on the heath. Due to me being a full-time wheelchair user from birth, it was my grand's idea that instead of having a tree house that had to be climbed, it would be safer and more practical to have a bush house that all us kids could use. Even though we protested greatly, although I'm disabled, I frequently used to climb trees in the local parks and over the heath, with the help of my cousins, obviously. Gran's word was final, and we never argued with her. She was a beautiful and lovely matriarch, but also as tough as old boots, and she was very scary when pushed. So with that, we busied ourselves in choosing an appropriate bush for our new play area. On selecting a perfect one, Gran delegated tasks to the older boys to clear the outer area of the bush, and also to make a little hollow inside it, with pieces of spare wood on the ground to serve as a basic floor. That way, my little wheelchair could run safely and easily inside it. Gran was reasonably young at the time, and while the boys were doing the heavy work, she arranged us younger ones in getting furniture, supplies, and accessories to make our new play space cozy and comfortable for all of us. A year later, our bush house was in full use. During the daytime, us younger ones played in it after school, on weekends, and on holidays, as well as some evenings and nights. It was a place where the older cousins could have some privacy away from the eyes of Gran and Mum to do whatever they did. Again, our bush house was cozy. We got chairs, bean bags, and even floor cushions donated by relatives and friends of the family. We also had a small table, for which we made a tablecloth, and our Auntie Jay made some pretty curtains that we hung up the best we could. We even had a cupboard where we kept snacks, and when the older boys or Mom were there, we were allowed to use the camping stove to heat tinned beans and sausages, or make pot noodles and tea. Gran's bingo friend, Jean, donated a hand-me-down rug. It was shabby and out of date, but we thought it was beautiful. It was slap bang in the middle of the summer holidays, probably in early July when this happened. Elle and I were 7, and G was 11. Our older cousin G's brother A was there earlier, but by 3 o'clock he had grown tired of hanging around with us and went out with his mates. The 3 of them would be coming back later to make us all dinner on the stove. Elle and I were sitting at the table playing Beggar Your Neighbor with a pack of playing cards that we got from the living room cupboard. And G was sitting in the corner of the bush house on a beanbag, reading The Secret Garden for the 3rd time. Basically, it was just another normal day at home, and nothing unusual or odd occurred until around 4. You see, that's when we heard a sound that was at odds with the peaceful scene. It was a mixture of a growl, an owl's hoot, and a man mumbling. We weren't particularly outdoorsy kids, being born and raised in the outskirts of urban London, but being bright little girls. We all knew that owls are nocturnal creatures, and the accompanying sounds that were mixed with the hoots did not come from the same bird. These weird sounds were joined by a furtive and stealthy rustling, coming from the back of the bush house, actually very near to where G was sitting. She jumped, stifling a scream by covering her mouth with her hands. We then saw a dark, dog-like shape through the dense foliage at the back of the bush house, which, incidentally, led straight onto the beginning of the heath, as I said earlier. The strangest thing about this figure was that it was very present, but rather ethereal, almost as if the figure was intentionally trying to hide. Also, throughout this period, there were no other natural sounds. No bird song, no insect sounds, no background human noise. Being right in the center of a council estate, you could always hear people talking, cars revving, and dogs barking. All those regular noises of urban community living. But at that moment, it was as if the entire world had been paused, and the 3 of us were the only ones conscious and present, along with the mysterious figure. We didn't know what to do, but we gathered together, and both G and L took one handle of my wheelchair and pulled me back out of our bush house, not taking our eyes off of the translucent figure as we went. When we were free from the bush house and close enough to home to feel out of danger and safe, we just looked at each other, very doubtfully. We were scared. G suddenly spoke. "Stay here. Don't move. Don't say anything." She ran to the garden shed, climbing up the side of the old, rotting roof. I completely lost it, letting out a squeal of utter fear. Quick-witted as usual, Elle put her hand over my mouth and hushed me. Elle and I watched while G looked over the hedgerow, which divided our back garden from the beginning of the heath. From our position, her face was clearly visible. G's expression was a mixture of confusion, surprise, and fright. Her pretty brown eyes looked troubled. We waited for G to come back to us before asking her earnestly what she saw. She didn't answer straight away, but when she finally did, she told us. "It was so strange. I didn't see anything. No dogs, no other animals. There was a man. I saw the back of him walking away towards the iron fence." My 7-year-old mind found it hard to comprehend what G was saying. and one look at Elle told me she was experiencing the same. We both said together, "What man? What did he look like?" G sighed, biting her lip. She paused, her young mind trying to summon the words to explain what she witnessed. "I didn't see him properly, his face and all that. I only saw his back. He had really long, scruffy hair, though." Her eyes wandered nervously to the end of the garden, leading out to the very public heath. Elle and I both followed G's gaze, and we all shuddered. For ages, none of us spoke. We sat in silence. G and Elle sat in the back step, and I sat in my wheelchair alongside them. Suddenly, I noticed something and exclaimed to the others, "Everything's back to normal. Listen." And we all listened. The regular everyday noises had come back, and the world appeared, suddenly, to have resumed business as usual. A while later, A and his two mates came back. They sensed some tension from us, and they asked what was up. We told them everything. Two of them ran out to the back to have a look around. They were out there for about 45 minutes. When they returned, they said they didn't see anything strange. No man, no animals, nothing unusual or dodgy at all. We spent the rest of the day hanging out with the boys, eating dinner in the bush house and later watching films and eating junk food. We didn't tell Mom about the experience until a few years back, long after we were grown, and we still don't know and can't explain what happened that day. Strange animal cries in the European countryside. From Bangus. These are two separate accounts that happened in the same location. I'm from Europe, a place where English would not be my native language. These may not be the most supernatural of happenings, but to me, in that moment, they felt truly horrible, and they terrify me to this day. The first time I heard a strange noise, I was taking a walk outside. It was sometime around summer, late in the evening, and it was already getting dark. I had just moved out from home and was living on my own for a year or so. I lived in a relatively small village in the countryside, and from my flat, it was just a 5-minute walk to grasslands and pastures, and another 20 to the woods. I usually walked a small route into the fields where I could sit under an apple tree and smoke. Normally, this was a very calming routine for me. Being outside while it was getting dark didn't bother me or creep me out. I liked the solitude. Where I live, there are no predatory animals that can be harmful to humans. I mean, the thing to be most afraid of would be boars. But around here, they're generally peaceful if you don't invade their space or seem threatening to their young. But boars make noise. They have a very distinct smell, too, which can act as a warning sign. I generally felt safe in the darkness, knowing the only dangerous creature out there would be another person. But as long as I wasn't using any light, they would have just as much trouble seeing me as I would seeing them. Anyway, as I made my way back and had almost reached the beginning of the village again, I heard it. I was just recording a voice message to a friend. Then I stopped talking for a moment and said, "What was that?" I began to walk faster. "Did you hear that too?" I was still recording. It came to my mind that I wanted to capture the sound, so I tried while speed walking away. To my right were empty allotment gardens, and to my left was a cow pasture, which usually contained a single bull. But the last time I walked past it, it was empty. The sound I'd heard was definitely no sound a bull would make. On my walks, I've heard foxes yelping and deer mating calls in the past, which can sound truly terrifying. But this animal sound, it didn't stop after one cry. It went on, and I'd never heard it before. It sounded like a low growl, but not like a dog. I was absolutely panicked by the thought that whatever was making these sounds could see me, and yet I could not see it. It was too dark around, no streetlights until I reached the brink of the village. But thankfully, nothing further happened, and I could make my way home safely. When I was in my room again, I replayed those voice messages, but I could hear nothing except me talking. I'm still terrified when I try to imagine what creature could have made these sounds, because it certainly wasn't any animal call I've heard. The second time was several years later, when I'd moved away to the city, but was visiting the countryside again to take a walk with my partner. At first, he didn't want to come, but I convinced him that it would be fun and romantic to take a walk up the hill in the woods to an old monastery, even though it was already getting dark and freezing cold. We parked our car in the village and walked to the pastures, even past the apple tree I mentioned before. At that point, we noticed that part of the trail we were walking on was frozen. At times, we had to walk very carefully so as not to slip, but we were kind of determined and didn't want to turn around because we had made it so far. There was a full moon that night, so even our walk through the woods up that hill was slightly illuminated. It was around Christmas time, so there was Christmas decorations and trees in the otherwise empty courtyard of the monastery. That kind of sounds creepy, but at the time, I felt very safe because I was with my partner. We had a great time holding hands and talking until we reached the pastures again upon leaving the monastery and exiting the woods. It was then we heard it. A howl. An eerie-sounding, long, very loud howl. We stopped in our tracks. My first thought was that it could have been a truck honking in the distance, which can sound weird and creepy at times, especially when the sound is carried over long distances by the wind. But then, whatever creature was crying out there in the distance howled again. This time, I was extremely sure it was an organic sound, nothing that could have come from a truck horn. "What was that?" I asked, panicked. My partner said, "Maybe somebody LARPing in the woods, blowing a horn." I was confused. I'm sure somebody has used these woods and the monastery grounds to LARP, but not in those weather conditions, not at night. "But it's freezing out here," I said, "and it's dark and the ground is frozen." I think he had just said that to calm me down. He knows I'm deathly afraid of wolves. "I think it's nothing to worry about," he said. I replied, "I'm sure it was just a truck honking, but can we walk a little faster?" I tried dragging him by the hand as fast as I could, but it was no run. He reminded me to be careful because I'm sure the last thing he also wanted was to slip and fall with that howling creature nearby. As we made it to the village again, the adrenaline wore off, and I began thinking clearly. "Where do you think that howling came from?" I asked. "It sounded kind of far away," my partner answered, "like it was coming somewhere beyond that hill in the woods." I was very grateful to be in the car when I realized that the howling must have come from the area around the trail we were taking up and down to the monastery. The thought we could have been near whatever was making those noises absolutely terrifies me to this day. As of now, we've come to the conclusion it could have been a wolf or stray dog. Wolves are sometimes passing through in the country, and I've just recently heard of stray dogs in the area. However, that may just be our excuse, because, to me, the howl sounded a lot more like the howling sound from the horror movie Ginger Snaps, right before Ginger and Bridget get attacked by the werewolf on the playground. But werewolves don't exist, do they? The Thing in the Attic. From LittleGhostTattoo. So, I grew up on the outskirts of a little countryside town in the southwest of England. The house that my younger sister, my mom, my dad, and I lived in was a small, slightly run-down house on the edge of rolling fields and woodland. I was lucky in the sense that I could spend my summer evenings playing in the wild, like the little goblin child I was. Our house was what they call a 2 up, 2 down. Essentially, it had a kitchen, a living room, 2 upstairs bedrooms, and a small bathroom. There was also an attic, with the entrance being a hatch in the bathroom ceiling. I think we occasionally stored boxes of decorations up there, but it was otherwise unused. It's important to note that my mom and dad had to use a ladder or stool to open the hatch to the attic. My sister and I shared a bedroom adjoining the bathroom. We had a bunk bed that we regularly argued over. Ownership of the top bunk was considered a privilege. On rainy days, we would happily play in this bedroom. On that particular day that I want to talk about, it was stormy outside, and we were confined to bedroom activities. At the time, our mom was working full-time, and our dad, who suffered from depression and anxiety, stayed at home to look after us. I was 9 at the time of this story, and my sister was around 8. Dad was having a bad mental health day and had put himself to bed in the adjoining room to ours, with the door shut. We could hear him snoring, and being used to his mood swings, we were trying to play quietly. It was during some game or another that we suddenly heard a loud thud from the bathroom. Looking out from our perch on the bottom bunk, we could only see the landing and the closed door to Dad's room. Worried that we had disturbed Dad, we stopped our play, and in the loud silence we heard a very strange noise. It came from the bathroom and sounded almost like our dad, but more like he was trying to talk while gargling water. Words can't really do justice to that horrible, strangled, and guttural voice. It started to say something like, "Hello, children." Now, our dad was quite imaginative and would often put on silly voices to play with us. While this mystery bathroom voice scared us, the only explanation seemed to be that Dad was playing a trick. We laughed nervously and looked at each other. The voice started up again, saying, "Hello. Come here, children." I can't remember exactly what it said, but it was something to that extent. We began laughing louder and saying, "Dad, don't be silly." At this point, Dad woke up from the next door bedroom and angrily came out, shouting at us to be quiet. We tried to explain, but he cut us off, warning us to be quiet. He then went back to his room and slammed the door shut. In the quiet that followed, we sat on the bed, upset from being told off, and feeling a horrible unease from the slow realization that that voice, whatever it was, had probably not been from our father. Slowly, we returned to our game and tried to forget, as children seem to do. Then, another thud came from the bathroom. The horrible gurgling and gargling voice started up again, laughing and telling us much more firmly, "Come here, children." That was it. We screamed for our dad. He ran out while we tearfully tried to explain. He was annoyed at first, but upon checking the bathroom, he found the attic hatch open. The hatch my sister and I would certainly be unable to reach. Now uneasy himself, he grabbed the ladder and a cricket bat to go and check the space. He found nothing up there in the small space, but darkness, cobwebs, and a few boxes. After this, we all headed downstairs, trying to watch some TV to calm down. The incident was largely forgotten, and life returned to normal. However, I, who had the top bunk privilege at the time, began to experience strange noises at night. Every few weeks or so, I began to hear stomping footsteps, which seemed to cross from one end of our bedroom ceiling to the other. The stomps were so heavy that if I reached out to touch the ceiling, the top bunk was that high, I could feel the vibrations through my fingertips. While this scared me, I did nothing more than duck my head under the duvet. No one else seemed to hear it. Years later, I asked my sister if she remembered the incident. She told me she didn't, and I'd pushed it to the back of my mind as maybe a dream or imagination. However, upon clearing out our parents' garage, we found her old diary. While reading through and laughing at the entries, which were mostly very unflattering accounts of my behavior as a sister, there was one that stood out. She had written about the day when we heard the voice from the attic, describing it as a goblin. She'd even drawn a picture of me and her on the bed, listening to the noises. I don't have the diary anymore, but as I'm about to clean out my parents' house, I'll keep an eye out for it and post photos of the entry if I find it. I know this sounds wholly unbelievable, but make of it what you will. One thing that might be relevant is the fact that we are of Irish descent, and I know there are many Irish folklore tales of fairies and fae folk who try to lure children away. Creature on the Northern Oregon coast. From Death Raptor 2004. Even my scientifically minded and rational fiancée came up short when I explained what I heard to her. I'll start by saying I'm a young guy who has had encounters with the supernatural ever since I was 8. I've had at least one experience every 3 years, it seems. Almost feels like a cycle. I've sent in a previous encounter with a possible hellhound, but this story happened much earlier. It was back in November of 2022 when I was visiting a campground in Garibaldi, Oregon, on the coast with my choir class, with a weekend excursion to get to know our classmates better. The camp we were at had 2 large 2-story group cabins, several trails, a mess hall with a basement, and other amenities. I'll not disclose the name of the camp, but if you've been there, you've been there. The first day and night of the excursion went incredibly well. We all got to know each other, and I had a horrible time asking out the girl I liked. Overall, we had a good time with my friends. However, when the sun went down, things changed dramatically. The atmosphere shifted, making everything eerie and unsettling. I didn't experience anything on the first night, but it was still very creepy. I'll quickly add here that my classmates and I hadn't seen a single animal during the whole trip, not even birds or squirrels, which was already bizarre. The next day was pretty normal, with our class going through all of our scheduled activities as the day went on. Dinner rolled around, and before I knew it, everyone was back in the cabins and turning in for the night. However, I couldn't sleep for some reason. I decided it would be best if I stepped outside onto the second-story balcony to help take my mind off of things. That's when I felt the same thing I did the night before. The feeling of dread coming back, as well as that feeling that there were eyes on me. The night was also deathly quiet, with only the sound of crashing waves on the beach accompanying me. But soon enough, that wasn't the only sound I was hearing. The sound came from the forest that ran parallel to the field, which divided the 2 cabins, and it caused my body to immediately go into fight or flight mode, and a chill ran down my spine. The sound in question was my own voice, coming from the tree line. "Come here, I want to show you something." Whatever it was said that in my voice, even though it sounded a little bit off, kind of like it had been recorded and played back. I originally thought that it was a figment of my imagination, so I rubbed my ears, hoping that I wouldn't hear it again. But alas, it came again. "Come here, I want to show you something." Exactly how it sounded before. I noped out of there, remembering the many stories I'd heard of things like skinwalkers, creatures that can mimic your voice. I ran into the cabin, closing the door that led to the balcony. Locking it, I closed the window too, hoping not to hear anything more. I fell asleep after an hour, only to wake at 4 o'clock in the morning. At that time, I heard a single heavy step making contact with the bottom step of the metal stairs which led to the balcony. I ignored it. I started to blast music into my ears through my headphones, drowning out any other noises of the night. I hoped this would be it, but these events would climax on the 3rd and final night of our trip. The next day, we went through the daily activities once more. Then night fell again. But this time, we would be spending the night, the last night of our trip, playing assassin. Basically hide and seek in the woods. Before we got together to play, a decent-sized group of my classmates and I were hanging out in one of the larger fields, which had woods on 3 sides and the rest of the camp on the other. We were lying out under the stars when all of us heard it. It was a loud, shrill screech, sounding like it was coming from very far away. In that moment, I was reminded that the further a Skinwalker sounds from you, the closer it could be. That's what some legends say. Those same legends say the closer it sounds, the farther it is. We formed a circle and turned our flashlights on bright, scanning the field and tree line, looking for anything out of the ordinary. Yet we didn't find anything. It was tense for about a minute, until our instructor and some other students came towards our circle, with their flashlights on, ready to play assassin. We were assigned our roles and began to play, entering the woods. Nothing happened during the games, or for the rest of our trip, thank God. I only tell people about hearing my own voice, as it's the easiest part of this series of events to describe. Not even my fiancé knows the full story. If you ask the people in that defensive circle, they'll deny that it even happened. They'll say we simply wanted to stand like that in the field. Some of them will flat out deny that the events in that field ever took place. I need you to keep in mind there are things out there that our kind can't even comprehend or explain. Be careful when camping in the coastal forests of Oregon, because there are things out there that will try to lure you into the woods where you may never be found. I Saw the Ozark Howler, from BenJammin. I've lived my whole life here in the rugged Ozark Mountains of Arkansas. Born and raised among these mist-shrouded hills and hollers, I know these woods like the back of my hand. The outdoors has always been a source of peace and joy for me, just like it was for my daddy before me. The two of us used to spend days out fishing on the river or hunting for deer and turkey in the forest. The land is in my blood. That's why the events of May 4th, 1999 shake me to my core to this very day every time I let my mind wander back. It was a Tuesday. I remember because I had the day off work and I aimed to make the most of it. The weather wasn't ideal for hunting, overcast with a thick ceiling of dark clouds threatening rain at any moment. But I didn't mind it none. There's a sort of peaceful, quiet stillness to the forest on days like that. I geared up and headed out to my favorite spot, a little clearing about a mile into the woods behind my house. The hike was uneventful, mostly just the soft crunch of leaves under my boots, and the occasional drop of rainwater rolling off a leaf overhead. Little did I know the peace of that day was about to be shattered by something I can scarcely explain. Something that haunts my dreams even now. I settled into my preferred hunting spot and waited patiently, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. After about an hour, a small herd of deer suddenly came bounding through the clearing. They were moving fast, their eyes wild. It struck me as strange since I hadn't made a sound. They weren't running from me either, but from something else, something that had spooked them pretty bad. No more than 2 minutes after the panicked deer had disappeared into the brush, an overpowering stench hit my nostrils, unlike anything I'd ever encountered. It was so foul and nauseating, I had to pinch my nose shut. As the ghastly odor washed over me, I became aware of a deep, rumbling snort echoing through the trees ahead. At first, I figured it must have been an old black bear rooting around. But when the hulking thing stepped into my view, not 20 yards from where I stood, I knew immediately this was no ordinary Arkansas critter. The sight of it paralyzed me with fear. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't budge an inch. All I could do was sit there, shaking uncontrollably, praying it didn't see me. That beast was enormous, easily 7 feet tall and covered in shaggy jet black fur. My first panicked thought was that it was a bear, but the more I stared, the more I realized it wasn't normal. It couldn't be a bear. Its movements were all wrong, too fluid, too deliberate. almost like a predator stalking prey. It walked on two legs but hunched over, sniffing the ground intently like a bloodhound. As it drew closer, I could make out a pair of curved, goat-like horns protruding from the thing's forehead. But the face was distinctly wolfish, with a long snout and pointed ears. The eyes reflected no light, just two black voids in a sea of matted fur. In that moment, my brain could scarcely comprehend what I was seeing. It went against everything I thought I knew about the natural world. Just when I didn't think I could be more terrified, the beast threw back its head, unleashing an ungodly howl that shook my whole body to the core. It was a rumbling sound, deeper and more chilling than anything that should come from an earthly creature. The sound seemed to vibrate through my chest. I sat there, paralyzed, afraid to run and afraid to even breathe. I prayed that thing could not detect my scent as I watched it through wide, horrified eyes. After what felt like an eternity, the massive creature dropped back down to all fours and resumed sniffing the ground intently. It let out several loud snorts as it seemed to catch the scent trail of the deer that had just bolted through. To my immense relief, it turned and began lumbering off in the direction the frightened herd had run. I remained frozen for a good 20 minutes after the sound of its footsteps faded away, unsure if the thing might double back. Finally, when I could stand the stench no longer, I tiptoed as quickly and as quietly as I could, all the way back to the trail leading toward my house. I didn't stop glancing over my shoulder until I was safe inside with the door bolted and curtains drawn. It was only after the paralyzing fear had finally subsided that I was able to process what I'd witnessed. Though it defied all logic, there was no doubt in my mind what I'd seen that fateful day was the elusive Ozark Howler of local legend. I'd ventured into those woods almost daily for decades, never feeling an ounce of fear. But coming face to face with that monster had scared me witless. Looking back, I don't know how I made it out of those woods unscathed. In my panic, I'd completely forgotten I was armed with my reliable hunting rifle. But I'm convinced now that if I'd fired that rifle off, I'd be the one that didn't survive the encounter. Warning: the following story contains depictions of badly injured animals. Can Bigfoot get chronic wasting disease? From Ghostmooner. I used to be a game warden for a certain state that I don't want to name here. I've seen a lot of weird stuff in my 8 years there, before I got injured in a gunfight with a drunk poacher. One of the stranger things I've ever seen while I was employed was something I saw walking past my vicinity one early autumn afternoon. Dispatch got a call about a person shooting at some deer right outside of someone's home from the street, and that the person shooting was shooting from inside a blue truck parked on the shoulder of the road, which is very illegal. So I headed over to the location and met up with another game warden. We started investigating the site. The shooting happened right on the shoulder next to a large house with a rather large lawn on the side of it that merged right into a thick woodland area. My coworker and I found a .30-06 brass shell casing in the dirt on the shoulder, and it was still warm, confirming the call. While my partner interviewed the eyewitness who heard the shot and peeked out the window in time to see the blue truck drive off, I searched the area for any possible bullet impacts or even blood drops from a wounded animal. I eventually made my way to the tree line, where I happened to luck out and find a fresh impact spot on a tree. I took stills of it with my phone. Then I noticed there was a bit of blood on the ground off to the side. I followed it into the woods. The land flowed up onto a steep but short ridge covered in trees, and beyond was some type of narrow gully that looks like it floods during heavy rains. I stopped on top of this ridgeline and looked around. Having lost the sparse blood trail, I scanned my surroundings slowly. That was about the time I started hearing something moving through the forest. It was coming from up the gully on my right, but out of sight because of all the trees. I thought it was the wounded deer, and I was about to step forward to get sight of it, but then I began smelling something awful. It was a faint smell of rotting meat, and other smells that I won't mention, because if you've been around dead bodies before, you'll understand that it's not just the decomp of the flesh that stinks, but what they eat or drink that also blends with it. What's worse is that it was getting stronger, and so was the noise. It sounded like something casually passing through thick bushes and dragging their feet across the ground. Whatever it was not trying to be sneaky. I was just about to call out, "Game Warden," to see if it was a person, but then I caught sight of something in the narrow spaces of the tree trunks. A flash of something dark brown, or mottled dark and brown. I don't know. But for some reason, it made me freeze in place. It slowly seemed to meander closer, following the natural openness of the bushy gully. The smell was much stronger now, and I had to breathe more through my mouth, and I could make a little more detail through the trees now. I saw flashes of hair or fur, but it was complex, and the moments I could see it between the trees were too short to absorb or process much detail. Eventually, it was at my 2 o'clock, and the trees were less dense now. As it visually passed in between them, I could make out more and more of what this thing was. It was large, very large. I want to say 8 feet tall and very wide in the shoulders. It was covered from head to toe in dark brown hair, but there was more to its appearance. The face looked like a caveman if he didn't shave, and it had black leathery skin. One eye was missing while the other was very foggy white. The mouth was agape, and it looked like it was missing some of its lower lip. The torso was patchy with large deep gashes with gray muscle tissue inside. But the worst part was that its abdomen was mostly missing, and what intestines remained were dangling off its right hip. Its left thigh had a huge part missing on the outside, and its right foot was just gone. It was stepping on its own ankle stump. I was frozen. I don't think I even breathed for the whole time it sort of lazily meandered past in front of me down the gully. After a while, I could no longer see it, and the smell was fading. So I carefully turned around, and as quietly as I could, I trekked back to my partner, who was extracting the bullet from the tree I found. He could tell I saw something weird because of the look on my face. He just nodded and said, "Had a jump out in the woods?" Which is our local lingo for, "You saw something weird out there, huh?" I nodded back, and I headed to my patrol truck, downing a whole bottle of water I had in a cooler. To this day, I have no clue where it was going, where it came from, how it got that way. I can only truly hope that it's an extremely rare phenomenon, and we all won't have to worry about it on a bigger scale. There is a type of disease out there that affects deer, elk, and even moose called CWD, or chronic wasting disease. It's very nasty, and I've had to put down deer who had it. But whatever this Bigfoot, Sasquatch, or whatever the heck it was, had, that wasn't it. This creature was very dead. Its flesh and soft tissue was gray-toned. To me, it was more like a zombie Bigfoot. Sasquatch on the Plains, from SnailSucker. I live in a very rural area on the American Great Plains. It's a small farming town with not much more than expanses of pretty much every crop you could expect that can survive out here in this semi-arid land. It's nuzzled up close to a large valley with fertile soil and a small creek that runs through it. An interstate highway runs 3 to 4 miles south of town. That's about the only paved road apart from city streets that are maybe 10 or 15 miles from here. It's a peaceful little place, and if you're not working the fields from dawn till dusk, there's not much else to do. I'm a 16-year-old guy, roughly 6'1", close to 160 pounds, and play as our football team's running back. Having freshly gotten my license and wanting to join the fun of going back and forth in the field for 14 hours a day, I asked a local farmer for a job. It was mid-planting season, so he set me to work rock picking and land rolling. For anyone that doesn't know much about farming, rocks can cause problems to the combine and their headers during harvest. So to deal with these rocks, farmers use a machine called a rock picker and land roller. The rock picker is quite a simple contraption. A wedge-like scooper is hydraulically dropped down to pick up a rock, and a large reel, much like on a combine header, sweeps it into a tank on the rock picker. It doesn't manage to get every rock, leaving the little ones behind. A land roller is just a large heavy steel drum that is pulled behind a tractor, used to push those rocks back down into the soil, making it out of the way of the combine header. So the farmer gave me the directions to my first field. So I drove the small rock-picking tractor to the field and got to work. This field was right on the edge of the valley, and there I could look out over the lush grazing lands and the freshly planted fertile soil below me. Although not many trees were present around town or abound most of the countryside, the walls of the valley were full of them. Large poplars and cottonwood trees covered the small ponds and sloughs not far from the edge. The trees stretched all along the valley edge as far as you could see. As I was scooping up some rocks on a dried-up stream bed, I noticed a doe and a small freshly born fawn run off from across the field. I figured the loud noise of the engine was making them scurry off, but I wondered why the fawn had run. Fawns usually hide in the tall grass and lay down silently, hiding from predators. I thought that was strange, but carried on. Rounding the field edge near where I saw them run off, I saw a large bedding location. I figured it might be from a moose, which we occasionally find in the area. That would explain why the deer ran off, but there were no moose to be seen. I circled around again to pick up another rock that I could have sworn wasn't there before. Then, to my surprise, I saw a rock land next to me. It came from the nearby trees. That freaked me out, so I turned the tractor towards the forest, and I turned on the night beams and flashers, even though it was day. The area under the tree canopy was dark, but I put a few thousand lumens directly where the rock came from. To my horror, I saw a crouched figure only 20 to 30 feet away. It was exactly the description you hear on those cheesy shows on TV, or those fake eyewitness accounts about Bigfoot. But this was so real. I could only see it from its mid-chest up. Its face had dark grayish-brown hair, but towards the chest, its hair color changed to a more orange or red-brown. Its face was squished in, eyes a seemingly gentle brown hazelnut color. Its mouth was remarkably human, but more ape-like, nose squished in and head pointed. It was so wide and muscular and just huge. It looked at me with its tender eyes, giving me a sense of caring or softness. In its eyes, I could also see power. It was like he knew just how large he was and that he was the top predator. But he was respectful and had no ill intent. I sat there and watched it until finally it got up and swiftly moved through the brush. I finished that field afterwards with no fear, but extremely curious. I left and didn't tell anyone until now, here on Reddit, a mere 2 days later. Bigfoot in West Virginia, from Electrionia. I had 2 stepdaughters living with me at the time. For years, I've been a night owl, staying up until 4 a.m. I would go out at 1, 2, or 3 in the morning to smoke. Behind my house, I had a patio with a tin roof. One night, I was standing there smoking with my back towards the mountain. These mountains went for miles and miles behind the house up a hill. While standing there, someone or something threw a rock at me. I turned around and said aloud, "What the heck?" I then went inside. Every night or morning at 2:30, my stepdaughter kept telling me she would hear something. I said, "What does it sound like?" She said, "A very loud scream." So these things went on for a while. She ran in one night, saying, "Did you hear it? Did you hear it?" I replied, "No." She had gone on a date that night. It was 2:30 when they pulled in. She said she and her boyfriend heard it. He was a hunter, and he said that he had never heard anything like it before. I went online trying to figure out what we were hearing. I played every animal sound known to man, "No, that's not it," she would answer. So I thought, what the heck, I'll play some Bigfoot sounds. Then when I did, she excitedly said, "Yes, that's it." "Are you sure?" I replied. "Yeah, that's definitely it." On another night, I went out to smoke. It started sounding like it was raining. I looked to my left, and with the light shining from the porch, I saw that it wasn't raining. Then I looked right, still no rain. But yet on the tin roof, something was throwing handfuls of rocks and pebbles. I couldn't see up the mountain, it was too dark, and I was frozen with fear then. But I knew for sure that someone or something was throwing pebbles at us. I called out into the dark, "If you're trying to scare me, it's not working. I'll be out here tomorrow night with my gun and spotlight," I warned. Then I quickly ran into the house. On another night, around 3 a.m., my stepdaughter and I were sitting in the dark on the back porch. All of a sudden, we heard 3 loud knocks on a tree. It wasn't a small stick hitting a tree. It sounded like someone had picked up a massive log and slammed it against a tree. We threw our cigarettes down and fell over each other trying to get back inside as quick as we could. We had to move because the mines shut down, but I can guarantee Bigfoot still goes through there around 2:30 every morning. Small Bigfoot disappears. From Daniel W. It was 2 a.m. on a very hot morning. I had gone to bed early that night, and I had to get my dogs out. They were 2 very large males that I have to keep separated. One of them had escaped out of the fence, and I did not look forward to going to get him. Not only had my dogs been barking like crazy that night, but all the dogs in the neighborhood subdivision had been too. This subdivision is surrounded by woods. I went down on the main street that runs through the subdivision. It didn't take long for me to find my dog. By then, I was wondering if the dogs out there were barking at me. All of a sudden, this figure on 2 legs comes towards me. It stood about 4.5 feet tall. Right away, I thought, odd that another kid would be out at 2 a.m. As it began to walk past me, I got a good look at it. I gasped. It most certainly was not a kid. In fact, it looked like a shorter version of a Bigfoot. I started to tremble. I stood there looking at this thing. Luckily, it didn't pay me any mind. It didn't even look at me as it passed me. Then, as I stared right at it, this thing faded out of existence. I was in denial then, wondering if I had hallucinated the whole thing. But the odd thing was I was completely sober. I began to wonder if there was a family of Bigfoot in the area. But even so, how in the world did this one just disappear like some ghost? This was definitely the strangest thing I've ever seen. Bigfoot saved me from a Wendigo. From Frank C. Having the grandkids over was always a fun time for us, as we were now in our early 60s. On one occasion, I overheard a group of them discussing something at the fire pit. As I approached, the eldest of them, Sarah, stood up and said, "No, nothing like that is real. I don't believe it." I now stood at their side, and one of them, Mikey, asked me, "Tata, or Grandpa, are Wendigos real?" "Now, where did you ever hear about that?" I asked. "Kids at school were saying that their older brothers saw them on YouTube and they're real." "Nuh-uh," Sarah exclaimed. "Right, Tata?" Now, there are lots of things we don't know about, guys." Just then, my son John walked up after hearing me. "Maybe it's time you told your story, Dad," he said. He then formed the kids into a smaller circle. Others gathered, and my wife, Marie, stood behind me and put her hands on my shoulders. With wide eyes all around me, I began my story. When I was much younger, your great-grandfather, my Uncle Robert, and I went on a hunting trip to northern Arizona. It was early December, and the first snow had already fallen. We reached our destination by early afternoon, and we set up by 4 p.m. My uncle had a nice trailer he towed with his big 4-wheel drive truck. We spent a great evening grilling steaks and laughing at old family stories by the fire. That night, I was awakened by my dad nudging my knee. "Time to get up," he said. I smiled and immediately smelled the coffee. I could never drink it black like them. I had to have some flavored creamer. After a good breakfast, we geared up and headed into the forest. The snow didn't reach the floor for the thick tree canopy, but it was cold. We were hunting large elk. I was carrying my Winchester 30-30 with 6 rounds in my rifle and another 8 in a sleeve on my stock. I also always carried my Colt 45 semi-automatic on my hip. The plan was for my dad to stay in the opening of a canyon, my uncle was to walk on the ridge on one side, and I was to walk on the other side, hoping we'd spot something or even move it towards Dad. I'd walked for an hour or so when I began to smell a wet, dirty dog odor. Thinking it might be a really stinky bear, I unshouldered my rifle. Not sure if I should continue or start to head back, I paused for a moment. Suddenly, there was a loud rustling in the bushes and trees to my left that caused me to jump back. I stumbled, and I began to slide down into the ravine. Luckily, it was mostly loose rocks, and I slid on my backside trying to hang on to my rifle. After I came to a stop, I checked for injuries or any damaged equipment. Everything looked okay. The small camping radios we had brought had no reception down here, so I began walking towards my dad's last position through the canyon. A small creek flowed nearby, and I was able to follow it. Not wanting to be the clown that scared any elk away because I was frightened by a bear, I refrained from shouting out and continued to hike my way out of there, every now and then looking up on the ridge to see that bear, but there was no visual sign of it yet. As the brush grew thicker, I had to almost walk in the water to avoid the branches. I'd walked for nearly 20 minutes when I noticed the forest had gone silent. I then heard my dad calling me from the direction I was coming from. I mean, it sounded like my dad. Then again, it didn't seem exactly right. It was like a good impression of his voice, spoken through an electric fan.
"Frankie, come over here. I need you here, now."
I looked hard into the shadowed woods.
"Come here, now," I said.
It sounded angry now, and no longer like my dad at all. He never spoke to me this way. "What do you want?" I shouted, receiving no response. I thought I could make out movement where the voice was coming from. "Dad?" I called out. Once again, I was hit with that terrible smell. This one was definitely not like the last one. This smelled like rotting flesh, stagnant water, and urine. I then heard this wheezing growl. I raised my rifle, not knowing what to think. I was pretty darn sure whatever this was, it was not my dad. The sound of branches snapping and brush rustling caused me to take a few steps back. What stepped out of that thicket can only be described as a hellish nightmare. This thing stood at least 9 feet tall, with the head of a large elk skull, including antlers, but it had only deep, empty holes for eyes. Its mouth could open way wider than it should have been able to, revealing shark-like teeth and 2 huge yellow fangs on its upper jaw. It was skeletal with patches of rotting flesh and fur. I could partially see right through its ribcage. It had very long arms with long black talon-tipped fingers. It stood on thick, bony elk-looking legs, ending in large, deformed hooves. My God, I thought, could this really be one of those Wendigo things from the legends? I fired right at it from about 30 feet. The bullet hit its chest area. Bits of bone and chunks of flesh blew off, but it seemed to have no effect on it. I fired another 2 times with the same result. I turned to run, but I could not maneuver over the rocks and ground cover as fast as this creature could. My backpack was suddenly ripped as it took a swipe at me. I ran until it shoved me from behind, sending me sprawling into the bushes. My rifle was at my side, but had proved ineffective. Thinking my family would have heard the shots and are headed my way, I began to yell, "Dad!" The thing 12 feet from me turned its head in the direction of where help should be coming from, then turned back to me. It let out a horrible screech and stepped towards me. I fumbled to get my .45 out of its holster, and I crawled backwards. Out of nowhere, a huge rock hit the monster from behind, almost knocking it to the ground. It turned from me, raising its head as if to get a sniff of what it might be. I now had my pistol in my hand, and I was thinking about running while the thing was distracted. A second large rock came flying from the trees, which the supposed Wendigo easily stepped aside to avoid. It looked back to me, then back to the trees. As it began stepping backwards towards me, there was a loud sound of branches breaking and a loud growl. I then recognized that familiar first odor I'd encountered, but it sure didn't sound like a bear, and I've never seen bears that could throw rocks like that. I then saw flashes of bright reddish-brown fur coming through the trees. With a cry-like roar, something big ran out and right at that creature. I had to have been dreaming now, I thought. It stood over 8 feet tall and truly looked like a Bigfoot. It grabbed the other creature by its bony shoulders, shoving it against a big tree. The supposed Wendigo began swiping its antlers at the Bigfoot. I jumped up and began firing at the Wendigo, sending several rounds right through its skull head. It looked at me for a moment, then shook its head like a dog with water in its ears. I wondered if I even heard it. Suddenly, the Bigfoot tackled the Wendigo like a linebacker, sending both into the brush. I hesitated. Should I run? Should I stay and try to help? I grew scared at the thought that if the Bigfoot lost, I would be dinner. I ran faster than I think I've ever run in my life, jumping over rocks and bushes. Soon I was at the opening to the canyon. Camp should be just over this hill. I ran into camp as Dad and Uncle Robert just got back too. "Was that you shooting out there?" they asked. I told them yes, and I explained what I saw. They both glanced at each other, smirking. I showed them my backpack as proof, which looked as if it had been sliced by razor blades. I didn't sleep a wink that night. Early the next morning, against all logic, I headed back into the canyon. Instead of my .30-30, I carried my 12-gauge shotgun with heavy ammo. I also took a basket and a backpack filled with meat, fruits, bread, and even a few sweets. I approached the area quietly, with my guard up. I soon found signs of a struggle. I opened my pack and took the items out, arranging them in the basket. I placed it on a big flat rock right by the stream. I took my New England Patriots ball cap off my head and placed it on the top of everything. I said aloud, "Thank you," and placed my hands on my chest, opening my arms wide in some attempt of making a grateful gesture. I gathered my things and headed back down. A good 30 yards away from behind me, I began to hear rustling in the trees. I looked, and I saw a 25-foot tree wiggling back and forth, being shaken by a very strong someone. I just had to see. I had to know. So I turned back up the canyon, and I was quickly back at the rock. But no Bigfoot in sight. However, the basket was empty, except for one of those huge yellow fangs that had previously been in that Wendigo's skull. I've heard that Sasquatch doesn't really like folks wandering into its territory, but I guess they dislike Wendigos even more. I also thought the first time I'd encountered Bigfoot via its smell, I believe he was trying to warn me about the area. Finishing my story to those kids, I told them, "So yes, I do believe that Wendigos exist, and I also know that Bigfoot exists. And someday, someone out there is going to capture footage of that Bigfoot up there, and he might just be wearing a Patriots hat." Thanks for listening to Unexplained Encounters. If you enjoyed the show, you can support us in a number of other ways. You can go to eeriecast.store to buy some creepy t-shirts or coffee mugs. Go to eeriecast.com to listen to and follow this show and our other scary podcasts on your favorite podcasting app, or follow me on Twitter @DarkPrevails for more screams and memes. Before I go, be sure to send me your scariest stories of the unexplained at darkstories.org. Until next time, stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.